Peace, everyone. Welcome to another BABTalk, episode 10. Brother Asafo here and your boy Geechee. We have a special guest, one who most of y'all know, but we'll let him introduce himself for the people who don't know this brother who we study and praise all the time. Go ahead and introduce yourself, brother.
You are very kind. I'm very grateful for the invitation and to be here. I'm Darrick Hamilton, the director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, and a university professor and Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the New School.
Awesome. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. It's an honor to have you with us, and we know you got a lot going on your schedule. So we're going to get right into the questions here. My first question for you, brother, is tell us a little bit about the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. What is the goal of that institute, and what are you all setting out to do for on that?
Yeah. So we're situated in a university, so we begin with research. And from my perspective, research allows us the tools to try to uncover and understand relationships and phenomena with some integrity and some rigor. So you might call that the truth building stage. And then unlike some other research institutes, we got values and goals. And this was your original question. Our goals are to generate economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity with an understanding that these issues can't be reduced to just class reductionists, understanding the inseparable roles of race, identity stratification as it relates to economics and politics, recognizing that when we think about economic well-being, obviously government and policy has a lot to do with that. So it's not novel if I tell you that economics and politics are related, or hell, it's not novel if I tell you that race and economics is related. But what is novel, perhaps, and what we do at the Institute is recognize that all three are inseparable. In other words, the ways in which policy is created, the ways in which an economy is stratified, all three have to be intricately linked. How do you get a white dominant political class to go along with 50 years of growing concentration at the top? Well, you offer them relative status. You say, however bad your lot in life may be, at least you ain't black, right? So that's one dynamic. So our institute is beginning with these type of foundations. But like I said, we begin with research, and we have the comparative advantage of being situated in a university which is committed to trying to understand scholarship in a way to better understand relationships and phenomena. But we don't just stop there, because we're not just into knowledge for the sake of knowledge building. We apply it in a way to lead to the goals that we describe, to offer human capabilities to facilitate that, the ability for people to have authentic agency in their lives. But then we also know that to affect change, you need public engagement. So we got research, application, and public engagement. We try to come on shows like this so that, one, you can kick the tires and hear if what I'm saying is making sense. You can tell me where you're looking at the wrong things. You really should be focused on this. And hopefully I can have some value added in offering perspectives, learned knowledge to help forge these movements to actually lead to change.
So tell me this, oftentimes when we organize it in Black spaces, a lot of folks are almost anti, politics. So Black folks who are a victim of public policy believe that somehow they can escape policy or politics and live in this separate economy. How do you disabuse people from this thought or mindset?
At the beginning, they're not separable. So at the beginning, you can't think about economics without politics. At the beginning, from a foundational standpoint, take the word market. A market is a political construction. It's not some natural, inevitable phenomena. That there are social structures by which people come together to define the terms of transaction. So from a fundamental perspective, you can't think about the economics without politics in a realistic way. But then, it's also important to know when thinking about power. And I love the fact that the institute that I'm a part of has power in its name. Everything we're talking about is really about power. Power as an input and power as an output as well. In the end, we want to be able to affect change in our lives, and that's power. And in order to be able to affect change in your lives, you need power. So one of the greatest tools that we have as a community is collective efficacy, is organization, is being able to take on problems in a collective way. And if that's not understood as politics, then I guess we need to do more to understand what collective power is and how it can affect change.
In discussions regarding poverty and wealth, we're often told that conventional methods such as entrepreneurship, financial literacy, education, what have you, are the most effective. In your research, you've demonstrated how that's not necessarily true. Could you share that information with us?
Yeah, and all the things you just described have an onus put on individuals. That if individuals were to have this spirit, this grit, this knowledge that they can affect change in their lives and rise up with social mobility to the cream of the crop and be part of the top. And you know what? That's a alluring narrative, right? That's an attractive narrative. From any fairy tale standpoint, we all want to believe that we got control. From a humanistic standpoint, you want to believe that you can affect change. And if I have children, I wouldn't tell them otherwise. I'm going to tell them to work hard and do all these things. But the reality from a structural point, at least as critical an ingredient, if not more, is resource itself, is power itself. However much ingenuity you have, when you engage in transaction with somebody with power, they have the ability to exploit and extract from you. It's not a fair, equal relationship. So we need power in order to benefit and implement our ingenuity, our grit, and our effort. So that's what I'm trying to get at. So that's one point. One point is it's a misnomer when you think about a relationship transaction to think that you can just do it when you engage in these without resource. But then on the other point, I'm a university professor, and you've heard me critique the narrative that all we need is education in the Black community and we'll be fine. Or for any population, all they need is education. So 2 points. Perhaps we have the causality wrong. When we look at the relationships between those with high levels of education and high outcomes, maybe it was the high outcomes like wealth that generated the high education. In other words, if I'm wealthy, I can buy access to a degree. If I don't have wealth, I can't. So first, let's think about the causality. Let me actually, I said 2 points, it's 3 points. The second point is that when we look across stratification by identity groups, you get this phenomena that ironically, race matters more at higher levels of social strata. So let me try to explain that a little more. If you don't have the characteristics by which to engage, then you are rendered somewhat non-competing. So I'm not making the case that low-educated Black people are better off than high-educated Black people. Clearly, that'd be an asinine statement to make. But if we look across race and we compare Blacks with low education to whites with low education, and Blacks with high levels of education to whites with high level of education, the disparities rise. And they rise in a functional way. If there's scarcity and I care about having the high rewards in society, well, there are 2 ways in which I can maintain that hierarchy. Render who has access to the characteristics that are competing. But then when somebody does get the characteristics, the second way is outright discriminate. So that's what I mean by race actually kicks into a higher gear when you have more resources. And it makes sense if you structure society in a hierarchical way. And then the last point, and I'm sorry if I'm long-winded.
No, it's fine.
The last point that I'm trying to get at is, education in and of itself as a reason to invest in and ensure everybody has access to from grade school all the way through college with empathetic teachers and a relevant curricula is in and of itself as an outcome worth doing. In other words, we don't need the explanation that education generates wealth or income as a motive to invest in education. The ability to be able to critically think and to synthesize information into big ideas is a human is a human endeavor that we certainly have enough resources and enough wherewithal and enlightenment that we should ensure that to everyone, period.
So I want you to follow me here. So as an economist, when you scan history, a lot of times we talk about Black Wall Street, Jonesboro, Louisiana, things like that, and oftentimes we claim it as thriving or prosperous place, but in reality, some of those places have high economic equalities, right? So majority of the people in Tulsa or Greenwood was working class or poor and working for white folks. As an economist, how do you go and begin to like disabuse people from some of these models that they want to go back to, given the current economic political conditions that we're in right now?
Right, and this is also part of the human psyche of narratives of romanticizing the past, of recreating a nostalgia of what things were. Anecdotally, when I look at basketball and they talk about the 80s, and I'm a product of basketball in the 80s, and they try to look at the athletes today and say, oh, they got it easy. Nah, I would disagree. I think that's a romance. Basketball was great in the 80s, but I think these young athletes today are doing things that I didn't see done in the 80s, for example. And that was just meant to be a little bit of a joke and levity in the program. But it has never been the case that Black people en masse have had political and economic power in the United States. It has never been, if we look at a dimension like wealth, it has never been the case that we have had a modicum of wealth that was empowering. So we romanticize the past. Now, there are communities in which there was relatively higher levels of well-being and resources than other communities. And there are examples of when those communities became a threat to the existing hierarchy that was pervasive of white supremacy, that there was a political and even economic sometimes backlash with even the use of violence and force to tear them down. And that story is worth telling as well. So, I would say that from a relative standpoint, Greenwood and Tulsa in Tulsa was a community that had acquired resources in both a relative and absolute sense for Black people more than other places in the South in that time period. And probably in response had that the Tulsa riot, the Tulsa race massacre, not riot, race massacre as a backlash. So, I'm being long-winded, but to answer your question, we romanticize in a past that's not completely accurate. And indeed, I wish even the labeling of Tulsa as Black Wall Street gives a preference towards finance in a way that is complicit in the notion of some of the American dream narrative of, some of the other things that took place in that community was we had bakeries, we had carpenters. There were other aspects of work, occupation, and human development well beyond finance, and probably more emphasized outside of finance. And that calling it Black Wall Street is almost an intentionality that doesn't give a complete, accurate depiction of what it was.
Could you speak with us a little more about the culture of poverty thesis and why that has been inimical to, I guess, the movement towards wealth equality?
Yeah, and I guess if we put the culture of poverty thesis in a historical evolution, it even might even be particularly useful, because again, we led with the point that stratification along identity, economics, and politics are inseparable, not just in the United States, but that has been true throughout human history. And that understanding allows us to understand power in general better, and having that comparative lens leads us to an approach and understanding that allows for a new course, because none of this is inevitable. We could have a more moral society. This is something that's attainable. So the culture of poverty thesis evolved in response to some of the gains that took place during the civil rights movement, or I guess ramped up and accelerated from some of the gains that took place during the civil rights movement. You know, before the civil rights movement, there was a stratification largely grounded in biology, where the world order was that Black people were just genetically inferior. So some of that narrative about genetic inferiority was not as politically feasible as society was moving on, in part from not just the United States, but geopolitics in general. So a shift to a narrative of a culture of poverty still allowed inequality to be intrinsic to the group that wasn't doing well. And also, from a political standpoint, allowed government to be absolved of a social responsibility of intervention, and said that as a result of conditions of the ghetto, as a result of previous discrimination, Black people have developed attitudes and norms that are detrimental for their own success, that they have become welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators in a way that if only they get their act together, they could be better. Their lot in life could be better. And what's more, if we give them resources, not only is that an undeserving allocation of resources, but it would further create dependencies to make them worse off. In other words, giving them welfare or any type of cash rewards or anything else will only serve the purpose of doubling down on those incentives where they engage in these detrimental attitudes and behaviors in a way that makes them even worse off. So you can see the politics of that narrative. You can see the economics of that narrative and the evolution of that narrative in a historical perspective. It has still allowed the system to exist that was in the past, but did it in a way that was consistent with the shifting norms of not being called an outright racist because you believe in a genetic inferiority. So in other words, it added a contextualization that still allowed for a similar situation. And some that might have a conservative perspective might say, well, if it's true, it's true, right? Because a theory is a theory. You can people can come up with reasoned explanations for various things. And I dare say, actually, that's wrong. A theory is not a theory. A theory is part of product of our socialization as well as our politics. But nonetheless, ideas can be generated, and we need to turn to empirics to try to understand if indeed these ideas are validated or not. And with the cultural poverty thesis, again, one of the things I led off with, which is ironic, of how you can't reduce inequality to this class reductionism, is that the disparities across Blacks and whites don't dissipate at higher social strata. They actually increase. And that's true today, and it was true in the 60s as well.
So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, we're only going to go for 30 minutes today. All three of us have an engagement to get to, so make sure you get your questions in, and we can dive into that. So one of the things we talk about as a think tank and organizers is like we want African-centered, Pan-African economists, right? And your work is one of the works that we pull on the most. So my question is, how do you have a position on the redistribution of wealth? And then what is the consensus among your colleagues in different political spaces? Like, do you see people agree with your statement that you're going to make, or less people agree with the statement?
So I'm going to start with the latter of if they don't agree with it, right? Politics are not static. So I've worked on ideas with others around things like federal job guarantee, baby bonds, and I think, Geechee, part of your question is alluding to reparations. So let's call it and reparations. And I'll get a reporter ask me, well, I hear you with those things, but give me something that can actually get done. What do you, right? They give me the question of, and my response is, if we don't, one, I actually believe that these things are right and actually can and are attainable. And two, the status quo would lead us to believe that they aren't. So politics are evolving, and if something's not realistic today, it may be tomorrow. So whether the discipline or politics agree or not, that ain't going to stop me. I'm committed to justice, and I know this ain't what you're asking per se, but I will say this: commit to justice because it's the right thing to do. That's something for which we don't need evidence. That's something for which it can be dogmatic. I follow it because I fundamentally believe in justice. The question about redistribution. Yeah, I mean, economists today oftentimes emphasize property rights. I emphasize human rights. I emphasize inclusive human rights, and among which economic rights is a critical element. If you want to have human rights, you need political rights, civil rights, social rights, cultural rights, but an anchor has to be economic rights. I mean, in fact, this neoliberal moment that we have right now emphasizes things like the right to vote, the right of civil rights, whether we realize it or not. It's disingenuous if you don't include economic rights. If you don't have some base level of resources by which to engage, you have no agency in your life. Rather, you're vulnerable to either exploitation or you're at the whim of charity, somebody offering you something. So at a base level, we need economic rights. So reparations. Reparations is a just policy. Reparations recognizes that even if you want to emphasize property rights and you want to come up with a society that says that government should protect what's been accrued by people and allow them to maintain it and utilize it and make transfers to their offsprings, then you are immoral if you don't recognize that the contemporary distribution of resource and power was born about from things that were highly problematic, like slavery, and I don't even have the right word to describe it, but wretched. So if you want to make an argument for property rights, then you absolutely need to, if you're consistent and if you're grounded in justice, in my view, then you also should be advocating for reparations, for to recognize what has taken place in the past and the ongoing, and correct for that in a way that redistributes resources in a more just way. So, I support reparations for a variety of reasons. One, it's just and the right thing to do. But also, from a political dimension, if we want to get away from the narratives that are inaccurate, that describe and ground poverty and inequality in things like grit and things like attitudes, because what reparations also include, in addition to the redistribution, is a full-throated acknowledgement from government that these things happened and that we were responsible for them. And what that does is limits the ability to come up with narratives about inequality that are inaccurate. In other words, the authority of recognizing this not only restores dignity to a population that's told that they ain't shit, that they this, that, and the other, but it also limits the capacity to come up with inaccurate narratives, but rather grounds inequality in what it actually is grounded in, which is resource deprivation in a way going forward. And I dare say that's not just a limited benefit for Black people. That's a benefit for white people or anybody else who's poor as well. Because, what do we do about white poor people? We describe them in, I'm going to try to be clever and use a word, niggardly terms, in ways that racializes them. We describe them as something other. We describe them as being wretched in a way that is very grounded in racial terms. So it will lead to a better society in general because it more accurately puts the onus of inequality on what it is, which is resource and other types of power deprivations.
So we have a few questions in the chat. But before we get to those, I want to ask you just really quickly. You've been very influential in the popularizing of the policy of baby bonds. So if you could speak with us a little bit about that. Reparations, we've just touched on somewhat. So baby bonds and federal jobs guarantee.
Yeah, and I'll start with and I know, look, I could spend an hour talking about these, y'all know that, and I know we got questions, so I'll try to start with an overview and make the point succinctly. One is baby bonds, federal job guarantee, single payer health insurance, Medicare for all, public banking, guaranteed income, what King and the Poor People's Campaign has talked about and is still talking about. I can keep going. There's a recognition that there's a certain enabling resource that without them, people don't have power in their lives. So we're not talking about the right to go to a disco, although if somebody go to a disco, good for them, that's their choice. But we're talking about ensuring that people have an adequate quantity, quality, and access to certain goods and services that without them, they are vulnerable in the ways in which they engage in life. Or if we want to put a positive spin, that they are empowered to affect change and to be self-fulfilling in their lives. And one is capital, a right to capital. Baby bonds is a birthright to capital. It's saying that the ways in which wealth is generated is it is wealth that begets more wealth. That it is being able to be a homeowner as opposed to a renter at an early stage in your life, being able to be an entrepreneur as opposed to a worker, being able to have a debt-free college education so that you can get into a managerial or professional job, that these are the groundings for people to build wealth. And there might be others, but all of these required capital. So however smart you may be, however hardworking you may be, without capital, inequality gets locked in. So baby bonds is intended to ensure that everybody born has a base level of capital, and that when they become a young adult, they can access that capital so that they can get into a resource that will passively rise over their lives. You know, I like to say tongue in cheek, the difference between a renter and a homeowner often amounts to a down payment. So baby bonds is intended to provide that down payment, for instance. Federal job guarantee, you know, again, inclusive economic rights. And by the way, I ain't the first person to talk about this. We can go to the United Nations in response to World War II and the aftermath of fascist Germany, came up with human rights, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And in that, they talked about political rights, civil rights, cultural rights, social rights, and the part that we forget about is economic rights, where government has a responsibility to ensure these things, to ensure that if you're sick, when you're vulnerable, at your most vulnerable point, you should not be thinking about finance. You should have the privilege, you should have the right to be able to engage with a healthcare system where at that point, finance should not be on your mind. This is a human condition if you want people to be have power in their lives. So that baby bonds, federal job guarantee, and reparations. I wrote an article about these being a three-legged stool for economic and racial justice. There are other policies which I talked about as well, but if I had to just pick three, those might be the three. And let me also say, reparations and baby bonds aren't substitutes, they're complements. Reparations is a retrospective approach that recognizes that sordid past. It has that truth and reconciliation, and it's the most direct and parsimonious way to redress Black-white wealth inequality. But even if we did, going forward prospectively, the way capital consolidates and iterates and exclude others, we would end up in similar or other types of stratifications that would be immoral, whether it's based on race or whatever, going forward. So baby bonds in a prospective way ensures that as a birthright, everyone will have capital, access to capital. And it's race conscious because it is the dimension of inequality that's most pronounced. You know, and again, historical perspective, we've made improvements between Black-white inequality in domains like income, in domains like education. Indeed, some of the education gap continues to narrow. Now, mind you, the income gap became stagnant around the mid 70s. But from 1940 to about the mid 70s, huge reductions in black-white income. Unfortunately, with the onset of neoliberalism, that gap hasn't really reduced at all. But I'm losing track of my point. That's terrible. I think the point was, as it relates to wealth, we haven't. And if you want to pick a dimension of class that's most that has the most impetus of redressing wealth inequality, it would be wealth. And that's what makes baby bonds a race conscious type program or an anti-racist program.
Okay, so we're exactly at 12:30, and we promised you we would get you out by 12:30. So we're gonna adhere to that. So
well, I don't have to be a jerk. Maybe we'll take 3 questions if that's cool, unless y'all got to go too.
So Geechee, how you want to do this?
Yeah, we can do a couple of questions from the comments. So,
okay.
You go ahead and pick a question first.
Okay, so Brother Diallo, who we've had on our show as well, he asked the question, and I'll read it to you. If being higher in the racial hierarchy than blacks is the reason whites accept concentration of wealth, how do you explain the wealth concentration in white societies and systems prior to colonization, enslavement, and in homogeneous white societies?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, in more homogeneous societies, oftentimes, and you may find some counterexamples, you end up with less disparity than in societies where there's more heterogeneous populations. But the general point is that these problems are not unique to the United States, nor are they unique to this contemporary framework, that this is how power works. So if we were to generalize and extrapolate larger into other societies, you will, the point I'm trying to make, it is the positioning of some other group, whether that's based on ancestry, hell, we can base it on gender or some other identity stratification that allows for a structure where capital, both political and economic capital, can seduce a dominant population by offering them relative status. Basically, there's a trade-off between absolute status and relative status. People care about status. And to the extent that you feel that you have less agency in where you appear in absolute terms, you're vulnerable to seduction of saying that, well, at least you're not that group. At least you're better than somebody else. And that is the point I'm trying to make. And that is the ways in which I think neoliberalism is operating today. Let's make it real quick. When Trump said to a white working class whose position, in the Obama recovery was still one of, it was, in general, we had the oxymoronic notion of a long recovery that was jobless and where inequality grew. We didn't end up in a Great Depression, but as society became more unequal, in my view, it presented the conditions for somebody like Donald Trump, a despotic leader, to come with a political narrative that was appealing to a white working class, where he said, however bad your lot in life may be, at least you're not Mexican, and I'm going to build a wall to protect your way of life. That political messaging is, I guess, what I'm trying to get at, that ability to seduce. That we know his policies of a tax deduction weren't beneficial from an economic standpoint to a white working class, but he did offer them something that was of value to them, which was saying that we're going to restore your hierarchical position in a ways that you felt was being entrenched upon. Not that it was, but in a ways that you felt was being entrenched upon.
So I saw Jared just show up late. By the way, he done
Jared, man, what's up? Sorry,
he done walked himself into a debate with a Bitcoin guru tomorrow. So he gonna be all right. Go ahead.
So Brother Kamari, he's asked the question. Curious if we if we've never had economic and political power in the U.S. in the past, does the good professor think we should try and obtain it in this space, the U.S., that we increasingly don't control? That's the last part. Don't control.
And I guess I got to be careful because I did say that, but it was a little bit hyperbolic. There have been times in which we've had more political efficacy than others. The civil rights movement, I dare say, not dare. The reality is that there were some gains made in the civil rights movement. Like I said, income is still grossly unequal, but we're in a better income position in the mid 70s than we were in 1945. Similarly, the ability to engage in politics was better in the mid 70s than it was in 1945. So there are examples of cases in which Black people have been able to exert power. So we're not a powerless population, but en masse, that's the point I'm trying to make. That for the most part, from economic and a political position, Black people have never really had power in this country en masse. But I hope I'm not portraying a pessimistic view that we can affect and have impact on our destiny. But I am, in the spirit of Jared, who I saw just come on, also making the case that from an economic standpoint, there are gross limitations on this self-help approach by just thinking in terms of commerce as a way to change our economic condition en masse. That ultimately, in my view, our biggest power comes from collective efficacy, which is through the means of politics, not exclusively through politics, but that would be one of the greatest places by which we can affect change and impact our destiny.
One last question, and I promise we'll let you go. So the SB Build Back American plan will only benefit white people, all set for union jobs. We don't own any construction companies, etc. What are your thoughts on the Build Back Better plan? And would it be beneficial to Black people in any way?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. It will be beneficial to Black people in some ways. Is it going to fundamentally, in and of itself, change the direction of inequality in our society? No, it's not enough. But let me start with some good news and then maybe some bad news. Because again, I think we need to also recognize some places where we can build upon and also demonstrate that we do have some power to affect change. Let's take the child tax credit. The child tax credit will lead to some benefit, $300. If we were able, now we know that it's on the chopping block and right now might not be passed, but hypothetically, if we were to have a permanent child tax credit of offering people $300 a month, for the most part, everyone who has a child, obviously they're cutoffs after you make $100,000, that will have demonstrable benefits to the Black community as well as others. But what I'm trying to get to is that the fact that we're in a political moment where we can even have a conversation about government using the tax code in a way that sends resources directly to people. Y'all did a change of screen and got me a little confused looking at myself. Sorry. In a way that sends resources directly to people is very different than the moment we were in when Bill Clinton took office. This is the 25th year of welfare reform. Remember that period where we couldn't fathom offering unconditional cash to poor people. And that was very racialized. We had the images of the welfare queens. Y'all remember it. Sister Soldier was used as a tool in that movement. Y'all could probably cite it better than me. So I dare say that there's at least some momentum that we can build upon. That again, something like sending money directly to people wouldn't even be fathomable. I hear the questioner's point, which is we certainly need an anti-racist lens when we think about policy. And I'll define what I mean by anti-racist. And I'm not the first to talk about this, but in the design and implementation of policy, even if they're inclusive economic rights, they need to be intentionally inclusive. In other words, we need to be intentional to ensure that by how we design and how we implement policies, Black people will be included. So I've referenced the past as well, and I referenced the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. We know in that period in our in the history of the United States, we had things like the New Deal, where Social Security was implemented. So, for example, when we first implemented Social Security, we did it in a racist way. And I know your audience is pretty familiar with that. There's some people that agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from that legislation. Well, that was intentional. It was intentional in its design because over 90% of Black women engaged in work were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker, and over half of Black men. So it was designed to exclude Black people. With a lot of the other New Deal implementation of policies like the GI Bill, it was left to the local administration of those policies. And we know that not just the South, but America, especially on a local level, was very racist in how they implemented policies. We can look at the land loss of Black farmers and see how the Department of Agriculture defrauded Black people of land in an intentional way, even if the policy itself didn't say that Black people weren't going to get it. So that's why I say by design and implementation, to reverse the wrongs of the past, we need to be intentionally anti-racist. The policy that's explicitly race-based is ultimately reparations.
Okay, so we'll stop with the questions there. That's exactly 3 questions, and we just want to express our appreciation. How can people get in touch with you?
So if you want to go to Twitter, what is it? My Twitter handle is @Darrick Hamilton. By the way, I'm gonna say something a little embarrassing. Well, it's humorous and embarrassing. Why can't I get a blue dot on Twitter? I don't get no blue dot. Other people do. Damn it, I got a good amount of followers.
You got to go reach out to your brother Charlemagne to get on that, man.
All right, I want my blue dot.
But yeah, thank you, man. Thank you for your time, and I know you got to get to your next engagement. Everyone, rewatch, share, comment, and we'll engage later on in the comments.
And let me say real quick, I appreciate y'all so much, and these issues are obviously serious, but you got to find joy in life, so add some levity. So sometimes it's good to be a little bit jovial, but the truth of the matter is that we're talking about sobering issues. But I really do believe that despair, pessimism will only facilitate the status quo. We can look throughout human history and see examples where change, however sustaining or not, has occurred, and really commit to that gold star justice and do it simply because it's the right thing to do.
By the way, Sugar Booger gonna get you your blue dot. She know Kamala Harris phone number.
I appreciate you, Sugar Booger.
All right, man. All right, y'all have a good one.
All right, peace.